Good evening. Thank you for joining us again as we are continuing to walk through our series, When Fathers Hide Their Sins, They Lose Their Sons. We're going to pick up where we left off last week, but first I just want to mention, if you watched the last video, I had several things on the screen on the PowerPoint. The location of the text we were reading was 2 Samuel chapter 13, verses 23 through 36. We're going to pick up from there from last week tonight, but on the screen, on the PowerPoint screen, I had 1 Samuel, so I apologize for not typing that incorrectly, but just kind of wanted to address that very quickly. We've been walking through When Fathers Hide Their Sins, They Lose Their Sons, and we saw last week the second payment where Absalom put together a feast and a plot to kill Amnon. Now, at the end of last week, at the end of last week's video, in verse 36, or at verse 34, Absalom fled. Absalom's going to run to Grandma and Grandpa's house on his mother's side, about 80 miles from Jerusalem, and he's going to hide out there. And so this week we're going to pick up in verse number 37 of chapter 13. We're going to read through a large portion of chapter 14 as well, and we're going to just talk about veiled deception, how to restore broken relationships. Now, the title here is a little misleading. I'm not going to show you necessarily how, but I'm going to show you 4 things not to do. David does 4 things here that continue to push and drive Absalom away. And so I want to show you those 4 things. There's 3 of them that happen on the up front of the part of the story. We won't look at it until we get through reading our whole passage. But there's 3 things that kind of happen on the front end, and then there's one thing that's the super powerful that finally just kind of severs the relationship that David and Absalom had for good, that he does close to the end of chapter 14. So let's pick up where we left off last week in 2 Samuel chapter 13 and verse 37. In fact, I'll read verse 36 so we can pick up from where we were last week. Verse 36 says, "And it came to pass, as soon as he had made an end of speaking," that was Jonadab who came and reported to King David that it wasn't all the king's sons, but it was just Amnon that had been killed. That when Jonadab made an end of speaking, that behold, the king's sons, the other sons, came and lifted up their voice and wept, and the king also and all his servants wept very sore. And that brings us to this week in verse number 37. It says, "But Absalom fled and went to Talmai, the son of Ammihud, king of Geshur, and David mourned for his son every day." There was, is it 1 Samuel chapter 30, I think it is, where it talks about David takes the land of Geshur. There's some debate over whether or not that's the same land or not, but whatever the case is, I think it probably is, because this is where Absalom flees to. This is probably where Absalom's mom comes from, this land, when he kind of took that land, and there was some diplomatic process that happens between lands when one is conquered over another. And so Absalom goes and runs to Grandma and Grandpa's house on his mother's side. And David mourned for his son. Verse 37 says, David mourned for his son every day. Not just Amnon, but also Absalom mourned for him every day. And verse 38 says, "So Absalom fled and went to Geshur and was there 3 years." Now, 2 plus 3 is 5. So now we kind of are at a situation where it's been 5 years since Amnon and Tamar, Amnon raped Tamar. And there was a sexual sin that occurred there. So we're now about 5 years in, but we're barely even a chapter away from it. Things are happening here in these chapters. They're unfolding very fast, but don't miss that there's a lot of time that goes on. It says that when Absalom fled, he went to Grandma and Grandpa's house, again on his mom's side. For 3 years he was there, and David is dealing with this internal, thinking about what happened with Amnon and Tamar, and thinking about what happened with Absalom and Amnon, and thinking about how in the world is he going to resolve these things. And now Absalom has run to Grandma and Grandpa's house, and he's out there for years, and David is thinking about this and thinking about this. And verse 39 says, "And the soul of King David longed to go forth unto Absalom, for he was comforted concerning Amnon." He had come to terms. I don't know if I want to say he made peace, but he had come to terms with what happened between Amnon and Tamar and Amnon and Absalom. It says, David longed to go forth to Absalom, for he was comforted concerning Amnon, seeing he was dead. This brings us into chapter 14. Verse 1 of chapter 14 says, Now Joab, the son of Zeruiah, perceived that the king's heart was toward Absalom. Joab never fully commits himself to Absalom, but he's kind of playing a part here that it's almost like, as we continue to read this, it's almost like Joab tries to play God here in this scenario. There's a lot of similarities here in chapter 14 with what Joab does with this woman from Tekoa. She's a great actress. She knows how to put on. She's a great storyteller. But he's going to use her, he's going to try to use her the same way that God used Nathan in David's life. And so it's almost like God used Nathan. He was God's man. He was the prophet, and it was God-ordained situation. Joab here, it's almost like he's playing matchmaker, like he's trying to solve a problem with this woman from Tekoa in David's life, and he's thinking to himself, well, this is how it worked with Nathan, and maybe we can create some scenario that same thing happens. And so in verse 2 of chapter 14 it says, And Joab sent to Tekoa, and fetched thence a wise woman, and said unto her, I pray thee, feign thyself to be a mourner. Come in and act like you're sad. Put on now mourning apparel. Put these clothes on. Anoint not thyself with oil, but make yourself look like you're not fresh, and you got old clothes, and you are making yourself appear like you're in this terrible state of mind. But be as a woman that had a long time mourned for the dead, and come to the king, and speak on this manner unto him. So Joab put the words in her mouth. Joab gives her a story, and he tells her, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go into the king. I want you to tell him this story. And that's the story's about to unfold, what the woman's going to say. And verse number 4 says, And when the woman of Tekoa spake to the king, she fell on her face to the ground, and did obeisance, and said, Help, O king. Boy, it's story time now. She's ready to put a play on. She is the actress. And she's got a made-up story from Joab. And a lot of these parts of this story, again, are going to be similar to what God used Nathan as a parable to get David's heart right. And David, as we read through this portion, you're going to find out David actually wises up to what she's doing and figures out what's going on. Remember, with Nathan, David was so blinded by his sin, he never could see that the parable was about him. Here with Joab and this woman from Tekoa, David's going to put it together. Remember, after the baby died, David went and he got his heart right with God. He went in, he worshiped, he cleaned himself up, he climbed up, he cleaned up, he got himself right between him and God. Now, that doesn't mean the consequences go away, but the relationship that him and God, there was no longer a blindness in the relationship that him and God had. So there's some wisdom that David exercises here in chapter 14 that he didn't exercise in chapter 12. And when Nathan comes in and begins to expound to him this parable, and David says, well, we're going to solve this problem. David still has a heart, and you see this throughout the situation with the parable that Nathan gives him. David had a heart to solve that problem. With this woman from Tekoa, even though this is a whole made-up story she gives David, and the made-up story, the purpose of it is so that Joab can get David to bring Absalom back to town. But still, this parable she gives, David is going to see through it. So she comes and she's playing her part. She's the actress now, and she says, Help, O king. And the king said unto her, What aileth thee? And she answered, I am indeed a widow woman, and mine husband is dead. So the protector's not there. And thine handmaid had 2 sons. Okay, she had a husband, she had 2 sons. And they strove together in the field, and there was none to part them. Her 2 sons got into an argument. Again, this is a made-up story by Joab, given to her to continue to David. And so she's coming in pretending she's a widow woman, pretending that her husband's dead, pretending that her 2 sons got into an argument in the field. In verse number 6, and it says, There was none to part them, but the one smote the other and slew him. Okay, so we got a story that sounds a lot like Cain and Abel. We also have a story that should be similar to what happened with David's sons. One son smote the other. So we're kind of pulling on some heartstrings. This story is starting to grab a hold of David. And behold, the whole family So now it's a whole family ordeal. Started out, her husband died. Then her 2 sons were striving together, and one of them killed the other one. And now the whole family, it says, has risen against thine handmaid. And they said, deliver him that smote his brother, that we may kill him. For the life of his brother whom he slew, and we will destroy the heir also. And so they shall quench my coal which is left, and shall not leave to my husband neither name nor remainder upon the earth. She's saying, if I don't have a husband, now one of my sons is dead, and now the rest of the family has said, well, somebody's got to repay, so bring him forth, put him before us, and we'll kill him too. And she's saying, all I have left now is this one little coal. Remember that story with Nathan? She had a big fire before. She had this family. She had a husband. She had 2 sons, and they were strong boys. And she has this whole big fire. But now her husband's gone, and one of her sons is gone. And she says, I just have this little coal that's left, and they're about to quench it out. I'm about to have nothing. Very similar to the story with Nathan the prophet about the man who had many lambs, and he wanted to go and take from the man that only had 1 ewe lamb. It says in verse 8, and the king said unto the woman, go to thine house, and I will give charge concerning thee. He said, I'm going to figure this out for you. I am involved in your situation. I want you to know I'm going to figure this out for you. And the woman of Tekoa said unto the king, my lord, O king, the iniquity be on me, and on my father's house, and the king and his throne be guiltless. And the king said, whosoever saith aught to thee, bring him to me. What she said in verse 9, when she said, the iniquity be on me and on my father's house, she's in essence saying, you're going to take a long time to try to solve this problem. You're a king. You got a lot of things going on in your life. It's going to take you a while to figure this out. And my family's, they're already after blood. Again, remember, this story is all made up. She's given him. But she's trying to push him into a corner and get him to commit to something, which he does. And so she's saying to him, you're going to take a long time to solve this. And of course she knows the longer it takes for him to solve this, and he probably finds out details, he's going to find out this story is just made up. So she's got another ulterior motive to get an answer right now. And so she's going to say, you're going to take a long time to solve this, and they're going to kill me too. And you'll be guiltless of the whole thing, king. Don't worry about it. It won't be your fault, but I'm concerned about my life. And the king said in verse 10, whosoever saith aught to thee, bring him to me. If anybody says to you that they're not going to wait on me, you bring that person to me. And he shall not touch thee any more. In verse 10 he says. Verse 11, then she said, I pray thee, let the king remember the Lord thy God, that thou wouldest not suffer the revengers of blood to destroy any more, lest they destroy my son. And he said, as the Lord liveth, there shall not one hair of thy son fall to the earth. She's continuing to push him in a corner. She's saying, they're after me. You're going to take a long time to solve this, so they're going to come after me for not giving them my son and telling them where he's at. And the king says, well, if they do that, you bring them to me, I'll solve that problem. I'll nip that in the bud real quick. And then she says, here's another problem, king. The revengers of blood, what happens if they just continue to search for my son and they find him and he can't make it to the city of refuge in time and they end up killing him? And he says, as the Lord liveth, there shall not one hair of thy son fall to the earth. So David's saying, listen, I told you before, I'm going to tell you again, I've got this situation. I'm paying attention to it. I'm going to take care of it. Verse 12, then the woman said, let thine handmaid, I pray thee, speak one word unto the Lord my king. And he said, say on. And the woman said, wherefore then hast thou thought such a thing against the people of God? For the king doth speak this thing as one which is faulty. Whoa, what did she just say? She's come to the king and she said, I got a problem, help me. She's got on this apparel. She's an actress. She's really putting on a performance. She's got all this whole thing going, and she gets the king's heart in it, and she puts all this before him, and Joab and her, I don't know about her so much, but Joab definitely is thinking this story is going to tug on the heartstrings of King David, because he'll be able to relate to 2 sons who are combative against each other, and the history that the Jews placed on Bible history. They wouldn't have called it Bible history, but on their history, the first 5 books of the Bible, there would have been some religious thing that kicked in for David, thinking about Cain and Abel out there in the field, one brother killing another, and now she's got him, this actress, this betrayal, and she actually says something extremely offensive here. She says, "Wherefore then hast thou thought such a thing against the people of God?" Why, if you're going to solve this for me, why have you thought to do something very similar against the people of God? For the king doth speak this thing as one which is faulty. She said, you're trying to solve a problem that I have with 2 sons, but you have a problem with 2 sons that you're not trying to solve. Remember, Amnon and Tamar, Amnon raped Tamar. David didn't do anything about it for 2 years. Absalom plots to kill Amnon, kills him, runs away to Grandma and Grandpa's house for 3 years. So now we've got 5 years that have passed, and she says very boldly to him, you're solving my problem, but you won't solve your problem. Why would you do this thing against the people of God, against your own family, against our nation? Why would you set a bad example like this? And she calls the king out in a way that it's just it's so bold, it's almost brazen, where she says, why does the king, for the king does speak this thing, in verse 13, for the king does speak this thing as one which is faulty. She says, you are at fault in your own life. And in that the king doth not fetch home again his banished. Now, I don't completely understand what I'm about to say, but there was some Jewish, even in the law, there was for Absalom's crime, he was considered as good as dead. What he did was murder. It wasn't a manslaughter situation where someone could run to the city of refuge. This was a murder, and it could have been proven by the king's other sons who were all there to witness what happened, as they all thought they were going to get killed too. So she's saying, when she says Absalom's banished, if Absalom was to show his face, the king would have a requirement to deal with it. And so she confronts the king and says, you're going to deal with my problems. How come you're not dealing with your problem? Joab's plan is starting to come to fruition. He's got a plan to bring Absalom back. Knowing David mourned for him every day, knowing that David longed to go to him, but this issue of murder had to be dealt with. Remember, Amnon and Tamar? David didn't deal with that issue. Absalom and Amnon? David's not dealing with that issue. Why? We are hampered by the bad example. The bad example, our own consciences work against us. And the bad example keeps us from doing many times. Some are mentally tough enough. They have enough mental fortitude to press forward. But most people get hampered by their conscience and by the Spirit of God that convicts of sin and convicts of righteousness. And they can't deal with these issues because they know they have them in their own life. And they feel like an utter hypocrite. So she says, you're not dealing with your problems. You got a son who's banished. So let me read verse number 13 again. The very last half of verse 13 says, in that the king doth not fetch home again his banished. For we must needs die. She says, listen, everybody's going to die. And as our water spilt on the ground. In fact, not only is everybody going to die, but people die so often, it's just like spilling water. Another person's dead here, another person's dead here. It says, which cannot be gathered up again. Neither doth God respect any person. Yet doth he devise means that his banished be not expelled from him. There's a really deep, great truth this lady says to David. Whatever it is, God has to deal with sin. He has to. It is a requirement. The holiness of God requires him to deal with sin. Yet somehow, some way, the mercy of God flows into the lives of mankind. The mercy of God flows into the lives of mankind. I still go back to, I'm not sure that I fully understand or fully get why David's son died and not David. And I think maybe when you look at the whole picture, there's some things you can start to deduce from that. But still, it just seems, what did that baby do? Why did that happen that way? And I certainly don't have all the answers to all of that. But I will say, the mercy of God flowed into David's life in that David lived when legally, biblically legally, he was to die. Same situation here with Absalom. But this woman from Tekoa says something extremely interesting. She says, God does not respect any person, yet doth he devise means that his banished be not expelled from him. God somehow allows his mercy to get into the lives, even when legally we are guilty. Still, the mercy of God enters into our lives. I heard a preacher say one time, I think it's tremendous, and I've been searching the scriptures for about a year now, trying to figure out, because the statement is so broad. It's so good, but it's so broad, I think maybe there's an exception to it. But he said mercy, the mercy of God, is always for the past. In the Bible, every time you see the mercy of God, it's always for the past. In the Bible, whenever you see the grace of God, it's always for the present and the future. And I just thought, man, that is tremendous, and really helped me understand how God dealt with sin from a justice perspective of mercy, the crimes of my past, and the guilt that I should have been the one that died on the cross, not Jesus. And yet still God found a way through his Son to extend his mercy to me. And now on a daily basis, into eternity future, the grace of God is bestowed into my life. What an amazing thing. And she says this deep thing to him, whether it was Joab that told her to say that, or she somehow perceived that. The Bible does say she was a wise woman. Verse 15 says, Now therefore that I am come to speak of this thing to my Lord the king, it is because the people have made me afraid. And thy handmaid said, I will now speak unto the king. It may be that the king will perform the request of his handmaid. For the king will hear to deliver his handmaid out of the hand of the man that would destroy me and my son together out of the inheritance of God. She's saying, listen, the people told me I could come and talk to you and you could deal with this situation. Verse 17 says, Then thine handmaid said, The word of my Lord the king shall now be comfortable. For as an angel of God, so is my Lord the king to discern good and bad. Therefore the Lord thy God will be with thee. Now, verse 16 and 17, maybe I'm inferring from my Western cultural perspective, but what I see in verse 16 and 17 is she had some strong words for David in verse 13, 14, and 15. Words that could have gotten her killed. But this story has tugged on the heartstrings of David. And now in verse 16 and 17, she starts to lay it on thick. The actress kicks back in and she's like, you are like an angel of God. And your wisdom is above. I mean, you just know how to discern between good and bad. And because of that, God will be with you. I can just hear her laying it on thick, almost like she's brought him to the edge where his emotions are volatile and he's ready to make a decision. And that decision may be he doesn't like what she's saying now. So that's the end of her life. So she dials him back just a bit to get him to a place where he says, okay, maybe she's on to something. And she saves her own life. Verse 18 says, Then the king answered and said unto the woman, Hide not from me. The king's starting to pick up on a couple things. He's picked up on the similarity of her story and his life with Absalom and Amnon. He's picked up on that there's some flattery going on here. He's picked up on a couple things here. And he says, I got a question for you, lady. He says, Hide not from me. I pray thee the thing that I shall ask thee. And the woman said, Let my lord the king now speak. And the king said, Is not the hand of Joab with thee in all this? Now, I think what we'll find out a little bit in just a few verses when this whole thing comes to pass and David does tell Joab to go get Absalom and bring him back home, it appears to me that Joab had already talked to David about bringing Absalom home. It kind of, the way it reads that way. Whatever the case is, whether Joab had talked to him before and David put those two things together, or he just figured out while this whole thing's going on that Joab somehow put her up to this. Unlike the situation with David and Nathan and the parable that Nathan gave David, unlike that situation, David seemed to have some wisdom and some discernment into what was happening here in this situation. And so he says to her in verse 19, Is not the hand of Joab with thee in all this? And the woman answered and said, As thy soul liveth, my lord the king, none can turn to the right hand or to the left from aught that my lord the king has spoken. For thy servant Joab, he bade me, and put all these words in the mouth of thine handmaid. To fetch about this form of speech hath thy servant Joab done this thing. And my Lord is wise according to the wisdom of an angel of God. Here she is throwing it, laying it on thick again. To know all things that are in the earth. Now that word earth there could also mean the land. That he's the king and she's appealing to his kingship. That he because he's the king, he has this great wisdom and knows everything that's going on in his kingdom territory. So he's caught her. He's put her on the spot. He's asked her, did Joab put you up to this? And she confesses that was the situation. So she's still thinking to herself, I'm still in the king's presence. Something bad may happen here. And I need to continue to exhibit a certain level of humility that I saved my life. Verse 21 says, And the king said unto Joab, Behold now, I have done this thing. Go therefore and bring the young man Absalom again. And Joab fell to the ground. So King David goes and gets Joab and says, Listen, I was wrong. I have done this thing. I was wrong. I should have dealt with it. I didn't deal with it. I should have dealt with it, but I didn't. So let's figure out how to solve it. I've done this thing. Go therefore, go get Absalom from Grandma and Grandpa's house and bring the young man again. Bring him back home. And Joab fell to the ground on his face and bowed himself and thanked the king. And Joab said, Today thy servant knoweth that I have found grace in thy sight, my lord, O king, and that the king hath fulfilled the request of his servant. Now, somebody might say, well, the request was made known by the woman of Tekoa, and I may be reading too much into that verse, but that's the verse that makes me think that Joab had talked to the king about it before. Now, I don't think that's a deal breaker if somebody disagrees with me on that, but it's just interesting how Joab says that. It comes across to me almost like Joab has talked to the king about it before. So Joab arose in verse 23 and went to Geshur and brought Absalom to Jerusalem. So Joab goes and he gets Absalom. Let's just recap here for a second. David mourns for Absalom for 3 years. Joab creates a scenario where he tries to duplicate what God did with Nathan with a wise woman from Tekoa. She comes in, she plays this actress and plays this part and tells this story and brings David to a place where he commits to do this thing for her, that is, solve her problem. And she then confronts him with strong language, says, you're so wrong for this, king, because you want to solve my problem, but you won't solve the problem between your two sons. She then lays on some really nice language, and the king puts it together that Joab is somehow involved in this conversation. He asks her if he is. She confesses that he is. He calls in Joab. He says, listen, I was wrong in how I handled this. I need to solve it. Go get Absalom. Joab goes, thank you for solving this. I'll go get him. So Joab goes and gets him, brings him back home. 5 years in Absalom's life. 2 years where David would not solve the problem with Amnon and Tamar. Absalom's growing bitter. 3 years, Absalom's run out to Grandma and Grandpa's house, and David won't go solve the problem and the issues between David and Absalom's bitterness continues to grow and take deeper root. In verse 24, David brings Absalom home. By Joab, he tells Joab, go get him, and he allows Absalom to come home. In verse 24, and the king said, let him turn to his own house, and let him not see my face. So Absalom returned to his own house and saw not the king's face. Now, here's the part about that. We're talking about how to restore broken relationships. And again, I told you this is not necessarily going to be a how-to, but a how, what not to do. Because every situation is different and every relationship is different. The how-to can change drastically. But these 4 things I'm going to show you are 4 things that you could apply to every relationship that's broken on what not to do. If you have a broken relationship with someone and you want to fix it, do not do what David did here in this situation. He did some things and he did not solve the problem between him and Absalom. I'm going to show you those now. First, what did David do? The first thing I want you to see is, if you want to restore a broken relationship with someone, don't wonder about them. Don't wonder about them. It says in verse 37 there, but Absalom fled and went to Talmai and the son of Ammihud, king of Geshur, and David mourned for his son every day. Every day. He's thinking about him. He's mourning for him. I mean, it's not just like he's sitting over in a corner sad, flipping his little king rod around, having a self-pity. He's mourning for his son every day. 3 years is going by, and every single day he's mourning for him. If you want to restore a broken relationship, don't wonder how somebody else is doing. Go to them. Go to them. Don't sit around and wonder and think about it and mourn about it. Do something about it. This is what the Lord said. The Lord made this very clear on several occasions. If you've got something between you and your brother and you bring a gift, leave your gift at the altar, go get right with your brother. If you got something between you and your brother, you need to go to him face to face. If he won't listen, go get witnesses. Come back. Address the situation. Don't wonder about it. Don't let it fester. Don't let the bitterness take hold. Don't wonder. If you want to restore broken relationships, don't wonder about the person. Go to the person. Go talk to the person. Now, it's going to take a certain level of humility. I mean, the Bible talks about only by pride cometh contention. So there's somebody, if not both parties, have pride involved in their life. Somebody's going to have to humble themselves. Somebody's going to have to take the first step. Somebody's going to have to do something to solve the problem. And somebody's going to have to say to themselves, I'm going to quit holding those old things against them, and I'm just going to, by faith, I'm going to pray about this. I'm going to seek the Lord with the desire to go and to solve the problem. Not sit around and have a pity party and think about, boy, I wish it was different. But it's not. So I guess it just never will be. It can be. It absolutely can be. But you have to be a big boy or a big girl or whatever it is and put your big kid britches on. And you have to go and you have to talk to people. And you have to accept that you have some fault in the matter. David had fault in the matter. He had fault in the matter. He should have dealt with Amnon and Tamar. He shouldn't have sat around for 3 years thinking about Absalom. He should have done something about it. This scenario where Joab goes and gets this woman from Tekoa should have never happened. David should have done something about it. He was the king. He was the one in charge. He should have sought God's face about it. He should have prayed about it. He should have asked his counselors that were godly counselors. He should have gone to Nathan. He should have just sent letters. He should have done something. But all he did was wonder. How's he doing? I wonder if it's ever going to be the same. I wonder if we're ever going to have it like we used to. And listen, it probably would have never been the same, but God is a God of restoration. He is a God of restoration. You can look all the way back into Genesis, the first Adam, and the prophecy of the second Adam. Christ came to restore man back to a relationship with God. It is the nature of God to restore. It's the nature of God to give himself. We didn't seek God. He sought us. When we couldn't come to him, he came to us. He is the one who's taken the first step. God is advertising himself. God is marketing himself. God is doing everything he can to reach a lost and dying world. But they don't want him. They sit around and wonder. I wonder if there's aliens on another planet or on the moon at one of the Saturn's moons or something. Instead of realizing that the heavens declare the glory of God. Not that there's other life out there. God is the prime example of taking the first step to people who didn't want him. He came into his own and his own received him not. Here we have David sitting here. He is the king. He could have taken the first step. He should have taken the first step. But instead, he sat around and he mourned and he just wondered, how's it going with him? I sure miss him. Can I just ask you, is there somebody in your life that you miss? You're like, man, I wish that we could have the relationship we used to have. Can I tell you, you have to take the first step. Relationships are two-way streets. You may take the first step. Let me just say this. You may take the first step and you may just get shut down. The person you're trying to restore with, they may just shut you down and be just an A1 jerk, okay? That may happen. And they may just yell at you and scream at you, but at least you didn't sit around wondering. At least you tried. At least when you go to bed at night, you can lay your head down and say, God, I did what you wanted me to do. God, I tried to restore. God, I tried to reach out. God, I tried. At least you can know in your conscience and in your spirit, in your mind, in your soul, God, I did my part. The only way this relationship is going to be restored ultimately is God gets inside of both parties. But somebody's got to take the first step. Don't sit around and wonder. Don't wonder how to restore broken relationships. First of all, don't wonder. Do something about it. Secondly, don't wait. Absalom fled and went to Geshur and was there 3 years. Don't wait. Some of you watching this right now know there's somebody God's already spoken to your heart about, or somebody who immediately came to your mind when you're thinking about a relationship you used to have that you enjoyed and it was good and it was sweet and it was special, but you waited. You waited, and the waiting caused you to second guess whether or not you really wanted to step out by faith and pursue restoration. So here's Absalom fleeing, going to Grandma and Grandpa's house, and he's there for 3 years, and David's sitting around mourning every day, and he's wondering about how Absalom's doing, and he's waiting for somebody to do something. He is the king. Folks, well, somebody in the broken relationship has to be the bigger person and forgive first. Somebody in the relationship has to be the bigger person and pursue first. And I go back to what I just said. In the relationship between man and God, God pursued us first. We loved him because he first loved us. David's sitting over here wondering. David's sitting over here waiting. I want you to notice thirdly, don't watch. Don't watch for the other person to do something. I don't know how many times I've heard somebody say, well, if they just would do this, then I would do this. Do not wonder how they're doing. Don't wait to do something. And don't watch for them to do something. Make your heart humble in the sight of God and ask God to enable you by the Spirit of God to restore the brokenness that you have in the relationship with the person. Go to them and stop expecting them to do their part. Do your part despite the fact whether or not they're going to do theirs or not. Do your part because it's what God asked you to do. Do your part because God did his part, and knowing that there'd still be some that reject him. God still died on the cross for the whole world, and there's still people dying and going to hell every day. It's not because God doesn't want to save them. They just refuse to receive him. And there will be people who refuse to receive you. But again, I go back to at least you can, at the end of the day, say, God, I didn't sit around wondering. I didn't sit around waiting. I didn't sit around watching for them to do their part so I could justify that, okay, now they're worthy of forgiveness or now they deserve my attention. But God, I did it out of love, the love that wanted myself to give me to them and wanted to see restoration. The soul of King David longed to go forth unto Absalom. He wanted to go to him. The emotions were there. The mental capacity and the understanding of what he wanted was there. But he could not connect the dots and bring himself to go to him, to somehow bring this relationship back together. And for 3 years, the first 2 years of Amnon and Tamar, that Absalom's got this bitterness that's growing and festering that leads to murder. And then the next 3 years where he's run away to Grandma and Grandpa's house, and he's probably out there, and his mom is probably telling him, or his grandma is probably telling him all the reasons why he's right. I don't know about your grandma. Maybe grandmas are different in the Bible times, but my grandma swore I never sinned in my life. My grandma's with the Lord now, and she knows I did at big time. But my grandma thought I could never do no wrong about anything. She thought I deserved the world. And maybe we have the Bible doesn't tell us. I'm kind of speculating now. But maybe Absalom runs out to Grandma and Grandpa's house, and Grandma's just every day making them blueberry pancakes, telling them it's not his fault. And whatever happens, the 3 years, the time is the key here. All time is doing in this situation is causing the festering of the bitterness and the sin in Absalom's life to grow. Now, I'm about to show you the last point here. This will probably be our shortest message, but I believe that this is one of the most powerful points in this whole story, what I'm about to show you. I have seen what David is about to do. The next point I'm going to show you, I've seen what David does to Absalom. I've seen people do in their relationships. And when this happens, I don't ever want to put God in a box and say it's impossible. But when I've seen what David is about to do, when I've seen this happen in real life, in front of my eyes, in broken relationships, it is almost like it is a complete and utter severance that you can't return from. I have never seen somebody do what David's about to do and their relationship ever come back again. I'm going to recap the story for you again so you follow along with me real quick. David's sitting at home. Absalom's run to Grandma and Grandpa's house. David wants to restore, but he doesn't. He sits around and he wonders about Absalom, and he sits around and he waits for somebody else to do something, and he sits around and watches to see if Absalom's going to do something. And then Joab brings in this woman of Tekoa, who's a wise woman, who puts on this story that pulls on David's heartstrings, and David finally comes to the place where he says, okay, Joab, go get Absalom. He says to him, go get him. Joab goes to get Absalom. Please, if you're watching this, please do not turn this thing off. This is the most powerful point in this whole story. What David's about to do is completely kill this relationship. You do not want to do what David's about to do. David sent Joab to go get Absalom. He sent him to go get him. And Joab goes to get Absalom. And I'm sure at some point when Joab goes to get Absalom that there's a conversation that happens between Joab and Absalom where Joab says to Absalom, Dad wants you to come home. Dad wants you to come home. Come home. It's going to be okay. Dad said he realizes he did something wrong. David said he realizes he was wrong. He said that in verse number 21. He says, I have done this thing. Joab says he recognized he was wrong. He wants to fix it. He wants to restore this broken relationship. He wants to solve this problem. Joab gets Absalom. And this is, from what I understand, is somewhere around a 7 to 10 day journey. They're probably having these conversations about what it's going to look like and how it's going to be solved and all of these things. And then Absalom comes home. And David does this. He withdraws himself. Do not miss this. If you do this, again, I don't want to put God in a box, but if you do this, you are almost signing the death certificate on the relationship. You do not get the opposite party's hopes up that the relationship is going to be restored. You do not give them hope and then snatch it away. And that's what David did in verse 24. David told Joab, go get Absalom and bring him home. And then in verse 24, Absalom comes home and the king said, let him turn to his own house and let him not see my face. So Absalom returned to his own house and saw the king's face no more. Absalom's sitting there going, what did I come home for? I thought we were going to be restored. I thought there was going to be a solution that maybe I was going to have to deal with some sin. Maybe it was going to be harsh or whatever. But I didn't think I was coming home just so you could completely reject me and not even look at me, not even talk to me, walk around like I don't even exist. You sent Joab to come get me. And Joab comes and he says, Dad wants you to come home. So come home. The king, he's realized what he's done was wrong. So I'm making this long journey, this 7 to 10 day journey. And I'm starting to have these feelings like maybe it can be like when I was a little kid. And we don't know much about Absalom. We don't know anything about Absalom's life when he was a little kid. But I think from what David talks about with Absalom, they had some sweet, special relationship. And Absalom's maybe thinking to himself, man, it's going to be like when I was a kid. And when I would run in and David would be on the throne and I'd come in and I'd be like, Daddy, Daddy, Daddy. And he'd be like, Absalom. And I'd hop up in his lap and it'd be this sweet thing. And Absalom's getting these ideas of whatever culturally that looks like. Absalom's getting these ideas and he's thinking to himself, we're gonna be restored. And then he gets home and David tells Joab, you know what? I changed my mind. I don't want to do it. It's too hard for him. He's too hurt. David's remembering all the stuff that he did and how painful it was when God sent Nathan to confront him. And David's sitting there after Nathan tells him what's going to happen, and David goes in and he prays, and they lose the baby. Him and Bathsheba lose the baby. Even though Solomon comes, they still lost the baby, and that's a heartbreaking. Some of you probably have lost children before, and that's a heartbreaking situation. And David is heartbroken over this deal, but it's affecting him for the rest of his life. And now he doesn't know how to deal with the sexual sin of Amnon, and now he doesn't know how to deal with the murderous spirit of Absalom, the same sexual sin that David had, and the same murderous spirit David had. And David doesn't know how to deal with these things because because this bad example has him strapped. And there's this moment where David says, okay, I want to get my heart right. I want things to be right. And I want it to be the same. And I want it to be different than what it is. And I want this back the way it was. And I have seen some people do this. And there's been a couple times I just sat in my office and cried thinking, why did they want to have this meeting only so they could just vent and just yell and not get right? Do not get people's hopes up. If you're going to restore the relationship, do not call them into the nearness of your presence. And when I say that, I mean emotionally, mentally, spiritually, not physically, but this hope that lives within them. Think about what it would be like, our blessed hope, that I'm going to just be on top of the world when the Lord comes back. I hope I'm talking to some liberal that I can just smack right in the face and say, I told you so, when he takes me right out of here. And I just zoom right out of here and I'm going up. But what would it be like if all of a sudden I get raptured out? And on halfway up, Jesus looks down and goes, you know what, Barrett? You just don't look worthy enough. I'm going to send you back down. All of my hopes would be dashed. I'd be utterly destroyed on the inside. God does not bring us into the nearness of his presence. He didn't tear the veil in the temple in two from top to bottom and then say, you know what? I'm sorry I did that. Let's sew it back up and put it back up there. If you sin for someone, if you communicate with someone, if you want to restore broken relationships, do not get their hopes up and then dash them and say, you know what? I just don't think you're worth it. You know what? I just don't think I can. You know what? I have seen, unfortunately, more times than I care to know or to have seen, where someone had just a single moment where they thought, maybe we can, and then changed their mind and ripped themselves away. And in those scenarios, maybe you're watching this and you say, well, Brother Barry, I know of a scenario where it didn't happen that way. Okay. Well, I praise the Lord for that in all honesty. I really do. There's a part of me about this point in particular that just wants to be wrong. I just want to be wrong. But this is where there was no turning back in David's life. In this situation with Absalom, this relationship is gone. Now, we're going to see that David eventually is going to forgive him. But this scenario, what happens here, there was no recovering from it. There was no coming back from it. The forgiveness and the relationship that David and Absalom had, it turned into superficialness. There was no realness. There was no heart connection anymore. If you want to restore broken relationships, don't wonder about how someone else is doing. Talk to them. Reach out to them. Don't wait to do something about it. Do it today. Don't watch to see if they're going to make the first step. Be the bigger person. Be who God called you to be, and take that first step no matter what it costs you in your reputation, no matter what it costs you in your pride. Take that first step. And if you do those things and the person responds and they come back, Absalom came back home and they come back, do not then look at them and say, you know what? I made a mistake and I don't want to be restored. Because when you do that, it's not like ripping a Band-Aid off. It's like ripping the heart out of somebody. They got their hopes up for just a moment. And then all of a sudden you said, you know what? You're not worth it. And I can't do it. And you completely destroy any opportunity to have a future relationship with that person. Again, do they have some forgiveness? Absolutely. But as we continue this story, you're going to find out that was all a formality. That's all that was a formality that allowed Absalom access back into the city so that he could then steal the throne from David. Well, I hope that you take some lessons from this. I know that I'm trying to, as I even preach and teach through it. This lesson here, in my opinion, among all the lessons, and there's still many more to come, is one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful one. If you want to restore a broken relationship with someone, do not wonder about how they're doing. Reach out to them. Do not wait to do it tomorrow. Do it right now. Do not watch and see if they're going to take the first step on whether or not you're willing to restore the relationship. Just make the first step because it's what's right. And don't, if they respond to you reaching out, do not get their hopes up and then withdraw yourself. That will crush them. Well, I hope this is a help. I hope it can be a blessing. I sure am prayerful over it. And if you're watching this, I want you to know that the Lord loves you. I may not know who you are, but God knows who you are. He sees right where you're at, and the Lord loves you. And the Lord wants you to learn some things from this. He wants me to learn some things from this. If we would but just let him be God in our lives, I believe he'd do a great work, and he would restore things. Maybe not back to 100% of what it originally was, but he would restore it, that there could be some sweet moments, that there could be something that could be brought back, that the blessing of knowing that there is a clear conscience between both parties. I don't know what price you can put on that, what price you can put on happiness between two people and laughing between two people. I just don't know what price you can put on all that. And I pray that you consider these thoughts from this passage and that the Lord would use them. God bless. Have a good night.